Crowds often see what is happening in front of them, but they do not always understand what is unfolding beneath the surface. The glances, the smirks, the deliberate exclusions seem like passing gestures to some, yet to the one enduring them, they cut deep. This flight is not just about reaching a destination, it is about how arrogance can disguise itself as authority, how indifference can wound as sharply as insults, and how a man's quiet endurance can one day force everyone to confront what they ignored. Elijah Mercer was a 72-year-old black man with a tall but slightly bent frame, his back curved from years of hard work and long nights at a desk filled with books. He had boarded the flight quietly, greeting the boarding agents with a polite nod and a faint smile, moving slowly but steadily down the narrow aisle to reach his assigned seat. His jacket was worn at the edges, the cuffs slightly frayed, yet he wore it with pride, for it had accompanied him through decades of journeys that mattered far more than the judgment of strangers. He placed his leather satchel carefully under the seat in front of him, his movements meticulous, showing the respect of a man who had always taken care of his belongings no matter how old they became. For Elijah, this flight was supposed to be simple, uneventful, a journey from one city to another, but from the moment the plane lifted into the air, subtle signs of exclusion began to form around him. As the beverage cart rolled down the aisle, the clinking of bottles and plastic cups filled the cabin, signaling the first moment of service where everyone could request a drink. Passengers adjusted themselves, some pressing the call buttons, others leaning forward with anticipation. Brenda Halford, the lead flight attendant, was polished in her uniform, her hair pinned tight, her smile broad for those she deemed worthy of it. She served drinks briskly, leaning in closer to younger white passengers, chatting briefly, ensuring they had what they wanted. Her manner changed, however, when she approached Elijah's row. Her eyes moved directly over him, as if his body had blended into the seat fabric. She extended a soda to the man beside him, passed a water to the woman across the aisle, then pushed the cart forward without a glance in Elijah's direction. He sat still, expecting that she might have simply forgotten, but when she returned down the same aisle, her focus remained fixed away from him. His dry throat longed for water, yet he kept quiet, unwilling to attract unwanted attention. The silence carried its own humiliation, a wordless reminder of how easily dignity could be stripped away when others chose not to see him. What might have been dismissed as oversight became undeniably deliberate when Brenda paused at his row, not to offer him service, but to pretend she was tidying. She dipped her cloth in a small cup of water, then snapped her wrist so droplets sprayed across Elijah's lap, darkening the fabric of his jacket. She looked down with feigned disinterest, her lips tightening in a gesture that was more smirk than apology. A couple of passengers nearby chuckled under their breath, enjoying the spectacle of an elderly black man fumbling to wipe his lap. Elijah pressed the damp fabric flat with his hands, his fingers trembling slightly, not from weakness but from the sting of humiliation. He had lived through decades of being overlooked, ignored, and demeaned, but such cruelty never grew easier to bear. In that crowded cabin, every laugh felt like a stone thrown in his direction, and every averted gaze confirmed how willing people were to remain bystanders. He adjusted his jacket again, smoothing it over his knees, his face calm, though his eyes revealed the weight of the moment. Brenda moved on without pause, her cart rattling ahead, her body language dismissive. For her, this was a small gesture, perhaps even routine, but for Elijah, it reopened scars etched deep into his life experience. The cruelest part was not the water or the absence of a drink, but the denial of his humanity, the deliberate decision to render him unseen. Humiliation in public spaces was never about the act alone. It was about the echo of history, the constant reminder that dignity could be stripped away in silence. Elijah leaned back in his seat, drawing a deep breath, centering himself as he had done in many storms before. He would not let her break him so easily, yet he understood that this was only the beginning. Such small acts, subtle in their appearance, often marked the start of something larger, the test of how much a person could endure before their spirit rebelled. The laughter behind him faded into murmurs, but the damage had been done, the seed planted for what would grow into an avalanche of humiliation. He closed his eyes briefly, gripping the armrest, reminding himself of the purpose of his journey. This trip was not about comfort or ease, it was about contribution, about the quiet legacy of his work, though no one on that plane yet knew who he was or what he represented. For now, he was just another passenger, one deliberately overlooked. Yet the way he carried himself, even under insult, reflected a discipline shaped by years of overcoming obstacles larger than one cruel attendant's gestures. Elijah Mercer was more than what they saw, and the day would come sooner than anyone expected when the truth of his identity would silence every smirk in that cabin. But in this moment, he endured in silence, his dignity intact though tested, his patience stretched but unbroken. The water stain on Elijah's jacket had begun to dry, leaving behind a darker shadow that seemed to echo the humiliation of being ignored. He sat quietly, focusing on his breathing, telling himself that patience had always been his greatest tool, but the subtle sting of laughter still hung in the cabin like smoke. His leather satchel shifted slightly under the seat in front of him as the plane encountered mild turbulence, causing the paper bag he had tucked beside it to slip out and slide a few inches into the aisle. The bag was nothing extraordinary, just a small sack containing a sandwich he had packed for himself, a modest meal prepared carefully the night before, the way he always preferred when traveling. He leaned forward slowly, his joints aching from age, his hands steady as he reached for the bag. It was at that moment Brenda appeared again, pushing her cart back down the aisle with sharp, deliberate steps. Instead of pausing to let him retrieve it, she angled her foot in a way that nudged the bag further away, a seemingly small motion but one filled with intent. The bag slid just beyond his reach, forcing Elijah to bend lower, his back straining as he tried to recover the simple possession. The passengers nearby shifted their attention toward the scene, their eyes following the elderly black man stretching awkwardly in the narrow space. Some chuckled under their breath, not with sympathy, but with a cruel amusement at his struggle. Brenda did not stop to help. Instead, she continued pushing the cart with a brisk pace, rolling her eyes dramatically as if to suggest that Elijah's small effort to recover his belongings was holding up everyone else. Her exaggerated gesture drew more attention than his actual movements, turning what should have been an unnoticed moment into a stage for his humiliation. Elijah finally grasped the paper bag, pulling it close with quiet dignity, but the damage was done. The sound of whispered laughter trickled down the row, faint but piercing in its cruelty. He pressed the bag carefully back into his satchel, his hands lingering a moment longer, as though grounding himself in the simple act of preservation. He had endured many indignities in his life, but the weight of being mocked publicly never lost its sting, especially in a space where he could do little to defend himself without becoming the target of even greater scrutiny. Brenda, satisfied with her performance, continued down the aisle with renewed energy, offering extra snacks to the passengers behind him, ensuring they noticed her dismissal of Elijah as deliberate. She leaned in closer to a young couple, whispering something that elicited a laugh, then straightened her uniform as though proud of her control over the cabin's atmosphere. Elijah remained seated, staring forward, his expression calm but his chest tightening with the familiar ache of exclusion. He knew what had happened was not accidental. The slight kick of her foot, the rolling of her eyes, the laughter that followed it was a cycle he had seen repeated in different forms throughout his life. On buses, in waiting rooms, in restaurants where service came slowly if it came at all, the message was always the same. He was to be reminded of his place, reduced, diminished in the eyes of others. Yet in those same spaces, he had also learned the strength of restraint. Each moment of humiliation became a test, a measure of how deeply he could control his response, how long he could endure before the truth of his worth inevitably rose to the surface. For Elijah, silence was not weakness. It was strategy, honed by years of being forced to prove his humanity in a world eager to deny it. Still, the sting of the present cut deeper because of the setting. On a plane thousands of feet in the air, surrounded by strangers, he was captive to the cruelty of one attendant and the indifference of others. He could feel the eyes upon him even after the moment had passed, some pitying, others dismissive, most simply entertained. The cabin seemed smaller, the air heavier, and though he kept his posture steady, his heart carried the weight of being singled out once more. The paper bag, now safely tucked away, felt heavier than before, not because of its contents but because of what it symbolized, his struggle for dignity in the face of orchestrated ridicule. Brenda's gesture had not been about the bag or the aisle. It had been about making him visible for all the wrong reasons, casting him as an inconvenience in a performance meant to amuse others at his expense. It was a cruel reminder that sometimes the sharpest wounds came not from words shouted in anger, but from quiet acts of mockery carried out with precision. Elijah adjusted his coat once more, smoothing its worn fabric over his knees. He did not look around to see who had laughed or who had watched silently. He had learned long ago that searching for allies in a crowd often led only to disappointment. Instead, he drew his strength inward, reminding himself that every insult endured was another layer of proof that his dignity came from within, not from the validation of strangers. The plane continued forward through the clouds, steady and indifferent to the storm building in its cabin. For Elijah, this was only the second step in what he already sensed would be a long ordeal. Each act of humiliation seemed to build upon the last, deliberate and calculated, pushing him further into the role of an outcast. Yet even in the face of such cruelty, there remained within him a core of unshakable resolve, a quiet defiance that time and oppression had not extinguished. He knew, deep down, that the truth of who he was would not remain hidden forever. Elijah remained steady in his seat, his eyes fixed on the back of the chair in front of him, determined not to let the cruel laughter from earlier break through his composure. The cabin lights had shifted to a warmer tone as the flight attendants began preparing for meal service, the smell of reheated food drifting down the aisle as passengers adjusted their trays in anticipation. For many, it was a routine moment in air travel, but for Elijah, it carried the possibility of another subtle attack, another carefully orchestrated gesture meant to remind him of where Brenda believed he belonged. The cart rattled closer, and Elijah adjusted his posture, readying his tray table with deliberate movements. He had traveled enough to know the rhythm of flights, the predictability of meals served in compartments, each tray carefully slid into place. When Brenda reached his row, her eyes flicked to his hands resting calmly on the folded table. She paused briefly, as if considering whether to acknowledge him at all, before setting the tray not in front of him, but just beyond his natural reach. The tray landed on the far edge of the table, forcing Elijah to extend his arm awkwardly, his shoulder straining, his fingers brushing at the plastic until finally catching hold. To others, it might have looked like nothing more than clumsiness on his part, but Elijah knew it was intentional. Brenda had leaned slightly forward when placing the tray for his neighbor, ensuring perfect alignment, yet with him she had delivered the meal with a casual indifference that placed burden on his aging body. As he pulled the tray toward himself, his hand trembled slightly, not from weakness but from the deliberate discomfort forced upon him. He settled it finally, his eyes lowering to the contents, a small portion of rice, vegetables, and a piece of chicken, packaged neatly in containers like everyone else's. He ate slowly, savoring each bite, not for its taste but for the calm it provided, a rhythm to steady his mind against the storm building in the cabin. Yet even that simple moment of nourishment was not spared from Brenda's cruelty. While others continued eating, their trays undisturbed, Brenda returned down the aisle after only a few minutes, her pace quicker than before, her hands ready to collect. She paused at Elijah's row, her eyes darting briefly to his tray that was only half finished. Without a word, she reached forward, her fingers curling around the edge of the tray, pulling it away before Elijah could swallow his current bite. The food was gone in an instant, snatched back as if he had no right to it. Passengers nearby raised their eyebrows but said nothing, the silence once again louder than any protest could have been. Brenda moved on smoothly, collecting trays from others only when they were clearly finished, leaving them time to enjoy their meal, yet with Elijah she had shown no such patience. Elijah sat back, the hollow ache of hunger settling into his stomach, but the deeper wound was not physical. It was the knowledge that she had stripped him of even the smallest comfort, that she had chosen him repeatedly as the target of her disdain. The humiliation was quiet, delivered in gestures that could be explained away if challenged, but the intent was clear, sharpened with precision. To be denied food in such a way carried echoes of history, memories of generations before him who had suffered far greater indignities, yet it also carried a personal sting. He had worked his entire life to break barriers, to prove that dignity could not be denied forever, yet here he was at 72, still reduced to a symbol of exclusion in a confined space above the clouds. He inhaled deeply, his chest rising with steady discipline, refusing to allow visible anger to give Brenda the satisfaction she seemed to crave. His dignity, though tested, remained intact, but he knew this was no isolated act. Each small cruelty built upon the last, forming a chain of deliberate assaults meant to strip him piece by piece until only silence remained. He would not allow that chain to hold him, yet the weight of it pressed hard. Around him, other passengers continued eating, their trays filled with food, their laughter and chatter filling the cabin as though nothing had happened. Some glanced at him with brief pity, quickly turning away before their gaze lingered too long. Others ignored him entirely, complicit in their silence. For Elijah, this was the cruelest part, not just the actions of one woman, but the indifference of many. It was the collective choice to let him bear the humiliation alone that deepened the wound. Brenda's footsteps faded down the aisle, her uniform crisp, her smile returning as she bent closer to ask another passenger if they needed anything extra. The hypocrisy of her attentiveness stung more than the hunger in his stomach. Elijah shifted slightly in his seat, folding his hands together on his lap, finding strength in the discipline that had carried him through so many trials before. He reminded himself again that this was not the end of his story, that truth had a way of revealing itself no matter how long it was suppressed. Yet even with that knowledge, the ache of injustice gnawed at him, a reminder that dignity was something he had to fight for again and again, even in places where it should have been freely given. Elijah sat with his hands folded neatly in his lap, the ache of hunger still settling in his stomach after Brenda had removed his meal prematurely, but his expression remained steady, his posture dignified. He had endured the denial of service, the splashing of water, the mocking of his movements, and the petty theft of his food, and though each act cut into him, he carried the wounds inwardly, refusing to allow the cruelty of one attendant to crack the discipline he had built over a lifetime. The cabin buzzed with low conversation, trays clattering as passengers finished their meals, some glancing at him with sidelong looks, but quickly returning to their own lives. Brenda reappeared with the same air of superiority that had accompanied her every move, her steps brisk, her chin lifted slightly, her presence commanding not through kindness, but through an energy of control. She stopped near Elijah's row and, without warning, pulled the latch of the overhead bin directly above his head. The door swung open with force, the hinge snapping loudly, startling nearby passengers. His small suitcase, carefully stowed earlier with the precision of a man who always respected order, shifted and fell forward, tumbling heavily down and landing in the narrow aisle with a dull thud. The suddenness of the moment drew gasps from those seated nearby, their eyes darting immediately to Elijah as if he had caused the disruption. Brenda stepped back dramatically, placing her hands on her hips, shaking her head as if the fault lay with him rather than her own aggressive handling. Elijah instinctively bent forward to recover the suitcase, his body leaning into the aisle, his hands wrapping around the handle. The act itself was harmless, yet in the context of what had already unfolded, it became another stage for his humiliation. He struggled slightly with the weight, his joints stiff, his movements slower than those of the younger passengers. Brenda remained standing, her posture upright, her eyes scanning the cabin to ensure that everyone had seen. She muttered a sound of disapproval, not words but a low noise that suggested incompetence, a deliberate sound meant to draw more attention. Elijah placed the suitcase carefully on the seat beside him for a moment, checking that nothing had been damaged inside, his fingers brushing the worn edges as though reassuring himself that at least his possessions remained intact. He lifted it back into the overhead compartment slowly, carefully, aware now that every pair of eyes nearby was fixed on him. When the latch finally clicked shut, a wave of relief passed through him, though the burn of humiliation lingered. Brenda did not stop there. She pulled a stack of safety cards from the side pocket of her cart and moved toward Elijah again. With swift movements, she pretended to check the cards in his row, her hand reaching suddenly across his armrest, her fingers tapping sharply against his sleeve as if to test his reaction. The tap was more of a shove than a check, jarring his elbow and causing him to flinch slightly, his body jerking as though startled. To the casual observer, it appeared clumsy, as though Elijah had fumbled in his seat, and that was precisely the image Brenda wanted to create. She leaned back, shaking her head once more with a look of false exasperation, turning the natural discomfort of an elderly black man into entertainment for the silent crowd. The humiliation was quiet, but it was complete. The tapping gesture had been unnecessary, the overhead bin had not required force, but each action was calculated to undermine his dignity in front of witnesses. Passengers exchanged brief glances, some uncomfortable, some entertained, but no one spoke up. The cabin once again became complicit in silence, a silence that weighed heavier than words. Elijah steadied himself, adjusting the sleeve Brenda had knocked against, smoothing the fabric over his arm with deliberate calm. He refused to let his face betray the sting of the moment, though inside he carried the weight of generations who had endured similar public shaming. Each gesture was small, plausible to explain away, yet together they formed a pattern of targeted cruelty that could not be denied. He sat back, folding his hands once more, anchoring himself against the rising tide of humiliation. Brenda turned sharply, moving down the aisle with her stack of cards, her back straight, her shoulders squared, her presence radiating a satisfaction that came not from service but from domination. She had turned her duties into weapons, each task twisted into an opportunity to belittle the one passenger she had chosen as her target. Elijah's eyes drifted to the window, to the endless stretch of clouds outside, white and unbothered, their silence purer than the silence of those around him. He thought of all the times he had been singled out, how each humiliation over the years had been dressed in different clothing but carried the same message, that his presence was to be questioned, that his worth was to be diminished in front of others. And yet, he had always endured, not with anger but with resilience, not by striking back but by holding steady until the truth of his dignity could no longer be ignored. The small suitcase in the overhead bin, the sting on his arm, the quiet laughter of passengers who pretended not to see all of it settled inside him as reminders of how fragile public dignity could be and how strong one had to be to protect it. The cabin had grown cooler as the flight pressed deeper into its course, the hum of the engine steady but the air inside sharp enough to make passengers reach for extra warmth. Elijah sat quietly, his body still, his spirit heavy from the cascade of humiliations that had already unfolded. He had been denied water, drenched with deliberate splashes, forced to bend painfully for his own belongings, stripped of his meal, and made into a public spectacle with his suitcase tumbling into the aisle. The memory of Brenda's hand striking against his sleeve remained fresh, the echo of her calculated aggression lingering in his mind. He sat tall though, his eyes steady, refusing to give her the satisfaction of seeing him undone. Now Brenda returned once more, this time with a bundle of blankets folded neatly in her arms, her expression carefully arranged into a mask of professionalism, though her eyes betrayed the same cold disdain that had accompanied her every move. She moved briskly down the aisle, passing blankets with a show of courtesy, draping them gently across the laps of passengers she deemed worthy. When she reached Elijah's row, she extended her hand outward, the fabric dangling just within reach. Elijah lifted his arms slowly, his fingers stretching toward the comfort that was offered so freely to others. Just as his fingertips brushed the edge of the blanket, Brenda pulled it sharply back, the gesture so sudden it caused his hand to falter midair. She pivoted slightly and set the blanket firmly across the lap of the white passenger seated beside him, smiling warmly at that man while ensuring Elijah saw the intentional withdrawal. A small laugh escaped from behind, not loud but enough to pierce the air like a needle, confirming that once again his dignity had been turned into entertainment. Elijah lowered his hand calmly, folding it once more on his lap, though the sting of exclusion gnawed at him. The message was unmistakable. Comfort belonged to others, not to him. Brenda adjusted the remaining blankets and then glanced at him as if weighing her next move. Her lips curled ever so slightly, her chin tilted, and she instructed him to gather his belongings. With a motion of her hand, she pointed toward the back rows of the plane. No explanation was given, no justification offered. The aisle seemed to narrow in that instant, all eyes converging on him as he reached for his satchel and the jacket still damp from earlier humiliation. His body moved slowly, not from reluctance, but from the pain in his joints, each step heavy as he rose from the seat that had been his since boarding. The humiliation of being singled out in front of dozens of strangers pressed down on him, echoing scenes from decades past when segregation had pushed black men and women to the back of buses, the margins of waiting rooms, the edges of society. That history lived inside him, not as a story from books but as lived memory, and here it was replayed at 30,000 feet. Brenda stood tall, ensuring her gesture was seen by all, her body language a declaration that she had the authority to diminish him without cause. Elijah did not argue, did not resist, for he knew that such resistance would only serve her narrative. He carried his satchel with measured grace, his coat folded neatly over his arm, his steps slow but steady as he moved toward the rows near the rear of the cabin. The passengers parted their knees reluctantly to let him pass, their gazes following him with a mixture of curiosity, pity, and quiet satisfaction. He felt the weight of every eye, each look a reminder that silence had again chosen the side of cruelty. When he finally settled into the new seat, the air felt colder, not because of altitude, but because of what had been taken from him. He smoothed his jacket across his lap, adjusted his posture, and breathed deeply, anchoring himself against the storm of humiliation that had not yet reached its peak. For Brenda, the act had been simple, one more step in a series of small cruelties. But for Elijah, it was a wound layered on top of others, a reminder of how deeply prejudice could be woven into ordinary gestures. The stolen blanket, the forced relocation, the echoes of history repeating in modern form, all of it pressed against his heart, but still he held steady. The back rows of the plane carried a colder air than the front, not because of the ventilation, but because of the weight of being sent there. Elijah adjusted himself into the narrow seat, setting his satchel carefully against his feet as though to ground himself, reminding his spirit that even when displaced, he remained anchored in dignity. The humiliation still pressed heavily against his chest, the echoes of laughter and silent stares following him like shadows that refused to fade. He had endured being denied water, being soaked with careless cruelty, having his food stolen, being forced into clumsy spectacles, being denied comfort, and now being publicly relegated to the margins of the cabin. Every act had been deliberate, designed to erode his dignity piece by piece, to strip him of presence, to make him vanish into humiliation. Yet, as he sat back and exhaled slowly, fate shifted. When he reached down to tuck his satchel more firmly under the seat, the clasp slipped open, and the leather-bound notebook he carried slid outward, landing softly on the cabin floor. Its cover was worn smooth from years of handling, yet embossed clearly on the front was the crest of an Ivy League university, the design unmistakable to those who recognize such symbols. The notebook lay in plain sight for a few moments, catching the attention of the man seated across the aisle, who leaned slightly to look closer, his brows lifting in faint recognition. Elijah bent forward slowly, his back stiff but steady, and retrieved the notebook with careful hands, brushing it lightly as though it were more than just paper and ink. He placed it on his lap for a moment before sliding it back into the satchel, but in that short pause the crest had already spoken silently, marking him as someone far removed from the image Brenda had painted with her cruelty. As he shifted back upright, the cabin light glinted against his vest, catching the small pin he had worn discreetly near his chest. The emblem was intricate, golden in its finish, crafted in the shape of a laurel wreath circling a national seal. It was a recognition awarded only to a select few for contributions of profound impact, the kind of honor that could not be bought, only earned through years of work that changed lives and shaped knowledge. The light bounced off the pin at just the right angle, sending a brief flash across the row, enough for the same passenger who had seen the crest to notice. He stared for a moment, his eyes narrowing as if memory tugged at him, some recollection of seeing that same emblem once during a televised ceremony. Elijah himself sat calmly, unaware of how the items had betrayed hints of his identity, unaware that in the silence of humiliation, the truth of who he was had begun to seep through the cracks. His body language remained composed, his face steady, though inside he felt the ache of being cast aside. He adjusted the lapel slightly, pressing the pin flat against the fabric, not as display but as habit, the way one ensures that something precious remains secure. For years he had worn it sparingly, never to flaunt, always with humility, but it carried a weight that no amount of cruelty could erase. Around him, passengers whispered quietly, curiosity rippling like a small wave, their eyes moving from the notebook to the pin, then back to Elijah's calm face. Some exchanged glances, their expressions changing from indifference to faint suspicion that the man who had been targeted with such relentless disdain was not what Brenda had assumed him to be. Elijah remained unaware of their whispers, his focus turned inward, reminding himself to endure, to breathe, to hold steady until the storm passed. Brenda, still at the front of the cabin, continued her performance of control, unaware that small cracks had already appeared in the narrative she had created. The murmurs that had begun in the back of the cabin after the glimpse of the notebook and the shine of the lapel pin had not faded, and though Elijah himself remained steady, quietly resting his hands on the satchel now securely fastened shut, the whispers carried forward like a current. The man who had first seen the crest leaned back in his seat, his memory tugging at him with insistence. He was an academic himself, though in a different field, and the embossed design was too familiar to ignore. He remembered an article he had once read in a university magazine, a profile on a black scholar whose research had transformed the way languages were taught, studied, and preserved. He remembered the photograph that had accompanied the piece, a man slightly younger then but with the same sharp lines of dignity on his face, the same posture of quiet command. The resemblance was undeniable, and as he studied Elijah now, his heart quickened with the recognition that the man being mocked and displaced before dozens of passengers was the same scholar celebrated in circles of learning worldwide. He whispered quietly to his companion, pointing subtly toward Elijah, their conversation hushed, but carrying enough to spark further curiosity in those seated nearby. More heads turned discreetly, their eyes narrowing, some pulling faint memories of having seen Elijah's name in programs or on academic websites. The crest, the pin, the aura of dignity despite humiliation, it was beginning to piece itself together in the collective awareness of the cabin. Elijah, unaware of their thoughts, adjusted his posture, gazing toward the window once again, steady in his silence. At the front of the plane, Captain Victor Hensley stepped out from the cockpit for his routine walk through the cabin. He was a man in his 50s, broad-shouldered, his uniform immaculate, his bearing calm and assured. He greeted a few passengers near the front rows, then moved slowly down the aisle, checking on the crew and the cabin's atmosphere. When he reached the middle rows, he noticed the hushed whispers drifting from the back, the slight shifts of passengers leaning to glance toward the same direction. Years of command had trained him to sense unrest, to read the small details that spoke of something deeper than casual chatter. His eyes followed their gaze until they settled on Elijah, seated calmly, his satchel tucked against his feet, his jacket folded neatly in his lap. Something about the sight struck Victor with a sense of familiarity, though he could not place it immediately. He continued forward until he reached the rear, pausing briefly as Brenda bustled past him with her usual haste, her expression tight, her posture sharp. He glanced after her, then returned his focus to Elijah. He stopped at the row, his eyes catching the faint shimmer of the lapel pin against Elijah's vest. The design triggered a memory, a televised ceremony he had once watched with his wife, where the President of the United States had placed that very emblem on the chest of a select few honorees. He had remembered being struck by the presence of a black scholar whose words during the acceptance speech carried both gravity and humility. He looked at Elijah again, and recognition flickered stronger. His gaze dropped to the satchel, where the corner of the leather notebook still peeked out. He asked politely if he could see it, his tone respectful. Elijah, surprised but calm, opened the satchel and pulled out the notebook, holding it gently before offering it forward. Victor took it carefully, his eyes tracing the crest once more before flipping open the first page. There, in flowing ink, was a signature etched with practiced hand, Elijah Mercer. The name matched what his memory had whispered, but the confirmation landed fully now. He knew the name from lists of honorees, from the archives of national recognition. Elijah Mercer was not just a passenger. He was a scholar whose life's work had preserved languages at risk of extinction, a man whose influence stretched across borders, whose research had been cited in classrooms, universities, and policy decisions. And most of all, he was a recipient of the Presidential Medal of Freedom, the highest civilian honor, an award that only a handful of individuals could claim. Victor closed the notebook gently, his eyes meeting Elijah's, the weight of recognition settling between them. He felt both respect and a rising anger at the thought of how this man had been treated in his own cabin, subjected to humiliation after humiliation by a member of his crew. Elijah, however, did not speak. His calm remained, his eyes steady, his silence dignified. He had not revealed himself, had not demanded respect through titles or honors. It was the cruel actions of another and the quiet persistence of his own dignity that had allowed the truth to surface naturally. Victor straightened, the authority of his position radiating in his stance, and returned the notebook with care, nodding once to Elijah with silent acknowledgement. The whispers in the cabin grew stronger, rippling forward, the realization spreading that the man who had been denied water, stripped of food, mocked for his movements, and forced to the back was not a nameless passenger, but a decorated academic, a national figure of profound accomplishment. The recognition that had begun as whispers in the back of the cabin now hung in the air with a weight that could not be ignored. and Captain Victor Hensley carried that weight in every step as he marched back toward the front where Brenda moved briskly between rows with the same false confidence she had displayed all flight. He intercepted her near the service station, his presence commanding, his jaw set, his voice low but firm enough that those within earshot could sense the gravity of his words. Passengers craned their necks to see, and the hum of conversation stilled into silence. Victor demanded an explanation, his tone not one of curiosity but of accountability, pressing Brenda to justify why a passenger, an elderly black man, a decorated scholar whose identity was now known, had been singled out for mistreatment. Brenda faltered, her carefully maintained mask of authority slipping as her eyes darted nervously across the cabin. She stammered something about misunderstandings, about procedures, but the conviction that had once bolstered her cruelty evaporated under Victor's gaze. For the first time during the flight, she was the one scrutinized, her actions exposed to judgment. The silence of the passengers, once complicit, now turned heavy, no longer mocking Elijah, but condemning Brenda with their collective stare. Elijah remained in his seat near the back, calm as ever, his hands folded, his expression unreadable. He had not asked for vindication, had not sought to expose her cruelty, yet the truth had risen naturally, undeniable now that Victor himself had confirmed it. And as if the cabin itself wished to strip away the last veil of Brenda's authority, one of the passengers seated across from Elijah leaned forward and offered to help with the satchel he had been guarding all flight. With a gentle motion, they lifted it, opening the zipper with care, as though handling something sacred. Inside lay not just the leather notebook but neatly arranged documents and mementos that told the story of Elijah's life. There were conference badges from universities across the world, each one marked with his name, identifying him not as an attendee but as a keynote speaker. There were programs from symposiums, letters of invitation from academic institutions, medals resting in velvet boxes that bore the insignia of nations and organizations recognizing his contribution to the preservation of culture and knowledge. Each item was a testament, tangible proof of who he was and what he represented, artifacts of a life built not on arrogance but on achievement, not on cruelty but on dedication to the pursuit of knowledge. The passengers who had once laughed or remained indifferent now leaned forward, their eyes widening with recognition and regret. The same people who had smirked when his jacket was stained, who had chuckled when his bag was kicked away, now found themselves face to face with the evidence that the man they had silently allowed to be humiliated was someone who had shaped the very world they lived in. Victor lifted one of the medals briefly, his expression stern but also reverent, before setting it back gently into the satchel. He looked back toward the front, his voice louder now, carrying through the cabin, addressing not only Brenda but every witness. He declared that no passenger deserved such treatment, least of all a man who had dedicated his life to work that spanned nations, communities, and generations. His words rang clear, cutting through the stale air of complicity, forcing every passenger to confront their silence. Brenda stood stiff, her face pale, her mouth opening and closing without forming words, the authority she had wielded so confidently shattered under the spotlight of truth. Her arrogance had thrived in secrecy, in the indifference of others, but now that the light had turned upon her, she had nothing left to shield herself. The passengers shifted uneasily in their seats, some lowering their eyes in shame, others staring openly at Elijah with newfound respect. The transformation in the cabin was palpable. Where once Elijah had been made into a spectacle of humiliation, he now sat as the quiet center of dignity, the truth of his identity drawing respect without his having to utter a word. His silence, once exploited to mark him as powerless, now resonated with strength, for it was not silence of weakness but of certainty, the silence of a man who knew that truth always rises. The evidence of his life's work lay bare before them, undeniable, impossible to dismiss. Brenda, cornered and trembling, looked to Victor for reprieve, but none came. His duty as captain was not just to command the flight but to ensure justice within his cabin, and justice had finally turned its gaze on her. She had sought to strip Elijah of dignity through small acts of cruelty, but now those same acts stood against her, magnified by the revelation of who she had targeted. The balance of power had shifted. Elijah had not raised his voice, had not demanded recognition, but the light of truth had shifted onto him, and in that light, Brenda's cruelty shriveled into weakness. The passengers, one by one, straightened in their seats, some nodding subtly toward Elijah in acknowledgement, others simply watching him with eyes filled not with mockery, but with respect. The atmosphere of the cabin transformed, the laughter gone, replaced by an air of solemnity, of reckoning. Elijah sat calmly, his expression composed, his gaze fixed forward, not basking in vindication but resting in the dignity that had always been his. He had endured humiliation with grace, and now the truth had revealed itself without his having to force it. The storm that had built steadily through the flight had begun to turn, the winds shifting against Brenda, her arrogance crumbling as the evidence of Elijah's true self filled the space she had once dominated. The descent began with a low hum that vibrated through the cabin, the engines adjusting as the plane prepared to land, and though passengers usually felt relief at this moment, the air on this flight was heavy with the weight of what had been revealed. The evidence of Elijah's life's work, displayed through medals, badges, and conference programs, still lingered vividly in the minds of those who had witnessed it, and Captain Victor Hensley's words about dignity and respect still echoed like thunder after a storm. Brenda stood at the front, her hands fidgeting, her posture stiff, her eyes darting nervously between passengers who no longer looked at her with admiration but with condemnation. Her authority, once wielded like a weapon, had crumbled completely, and now the silence of the cabin judged her more harshly than any words could. Elijah remained in his seat, calm and composed, his satchel closed once more, the truths of his identity tucked away not as a shield, but as a reminder that dignity was always his to keep. The plane touched down with a gentle jolt, tires screeching faintly against the runway, and the announcement of arrival rang through the speakers. But even that ordinary moment felt charged with the memory of what had transpired. Passengers shifted in their seats, glancing between one another, the reality of their complicity pressing heavily. Some had laughed, some had stayed silent, but now all of them understood that they had witnessed not just mistreatment but injustice, and that injustice had been turned on a man of profound honor. As the plane taxied to the gate, the murmurs began again, this time not mocking but indignant. A few passengers spoke of filing complaints, their voices carrying clearly enough that Brenda's face tightened further. Others tapped their phones, scrolling through video recordings they had captured during the flight, evidence of her petty cruelties preserved in frames that could not be denied. The weight of accountability had arrived, and unlike earlier in the flight, there would be no silence to protect her. The seatbelt sign switched off, and the cabin filled with the usual rustle of passengers rising to gather their belongings, but before anyone could disembark, the door to the plane opened and a pair of airline managers stepped in, their uniforms crisp, their faces stern. They moved directly to the front, their eyes sweeping the cabin before landing on Brenda, who froze where she stood. Captain Victor greeted them briefly, his expression grim, then gestured toward her with a firm nod. The managers spoke quietly but firmly, their words clipped, their instructions final. Brenda's hands shook as they relieved her of duty, the suspension immediate, her protests stumbling and weak against the weight of passenger complaints and recorded evidence. The passengers themselves began to speak up, some raising their voices to describe what they had seen, others lifting their phones to show videos, the collective testimony ringing like a chorus of condemnation. Brenda's authority was gone, stripped publicly as she had stripped Elijah of dignity, the justice swift and undeniable. She was escorted off the plane, her posture collapsed, her arrogance shattered, her silence now the silence of defeat. The passengers, freed from her oppressive presence, shifted their focus toward Elijah. As the crowd prepared to disembark, several stood deliberately, positioning themselves around him, a quiet act of protection and solidarity. Where once they had laughed or remained indifferent, now they offered their presence as a shield, guiding him toward the exit with a dignity that had been denied him earlier. The man who had first recognized the crest walked beside him, his head slightly bowed in respect, while others nodded or whispered apologies, their eyes filled with regret. Elijah accepted their gestures with calm, not gloating in vindication, not seeking to punish, but simply carrying himself with the same steady dignity he had held throughout the ordeal. The crowd parted gently as he moved forward, his small suitcase in hand, his satchel resting against his side, the symbols of his identity not displayed but carried close as they had always been. The journey through the narrow aisle felt different now, not the lonely walk of humiliation he had endured earlier when Brenda forced him to the back, but a walk accompanied by recognition, by acknowledgement, by respect. When he reached the exit, Victor stood waiting, his hand resting firmly on the doorframe, his eyes meeting Elijah's with a look that carried both apology and admiration. He extended a slight nod, a silent acknowledgement of the strength Elijah had shown and the injustice he had endured. Elijah returned the nod, his expression calm, his eyes steady, his silence once again speaking louder than words. Outside the plane, the air felt cool and fresh, the kind of air that reminded him of freedom, of survival, of moving forward despite everything. The passengers who had surrounded him followed for a short distance, ensuring he was not overwhelmed by the crowd waiting in the terminal. Some placed gentle hands on his shoulder, others offered brief words of respect, but Elijah carried himself without need of comfort, his dignity restored not by their gestures but by the truth of who he had always been. The terminal buzzed with the usual noise of arrivals, rolling suitcases, and hurried footsteps, but for Elijah, the world seemed to move in slow rhythm as he stepped out of the jet bridge, his satchel secure against his side, his suitcase trailing behind him with the familiar rattle of old wheels. The passengers who had encircled him for protection gradually dispersed, their own lives calling them away, yet many still turned back for one last glance, their eyes filled with something heavier than pity and stronger than admiration. They had seen what he endured, they had seen the dignity with which he carried himself, and now they bore the weight of knowing that silence in the face of injustice is never neutral, it always sides with the oppressor. Elijah paused near the end of the walkway, adjusting his jacket, smoothing the damp fabric that still bore the faint stain of Brenda's early cruelty, and looked back toward the plane. Inside, Captain Victor remained with the rest of the crew, his voice rising above the cabin before the passengers fully disembarked. He spoke not with rehearsed authority but with the conviction of a man who had witnessed injustice and refused to allow it to linger. His words carried through the narrow space, sharp and clear. In the sky, there is no room for arrogance or prejudice, only respect for every human being who steps aboard. The words struck the cabin like a bell, reverberating through those still seated, forcing them to confront what they had seen and failed to challenge until it was nearly too late. Some lowered their heads, ashamed, others nodded with relief that truth had been spoken aloud, and then, slowly, the cabin filled with the sound of applause. It began with a few, then grew into a standing ovation, a collective acknowledgement that dignity had triumphed over cruelty. Brenda was no longer there to wield her false authority. She had been removed, stripped of her power, and the space she left behind was filled instead with recognition of Elijah's unshakable dignity. Elijah himself did not seek the applause, did not turn back to bask in it, for he had never lived his life for the recognition of crowds. His work, his legacy, his very being had always been rooted in something deeper than praise, the preservation of knowledge, the belief in the worth of every voice, the unshakable conviction that justice must prevail, even in silence. He continued forward through the terminal, his steps measured, his face calm, carrying himself as he always had, with quiet strength. Yet the moment lingered, not just for him but for everyone who had borne witness. For the passengers, the flight had become more than a journey from one city to another. It had become a lesson, a mirror held to their own silence, a call to never again stand idle when cruelty unfolds before their eyes. For Victor, it was a reminder of the responsibility of leadership, not only to fly the plane, but to defend the dignity of every soul entrusted to his care. And for Elijah, it was confirmation of what he had always known. Dignity does not come from the recognition of others, but from the certainty of one's own worth. A certainty that cannot be taken away no matter how many times prejudice attempts to diminish it. As he reached the exit of the terminal, the sunlight poured in through wide glass windows, bathing him in warmth, and in that light the truth of the journey settled fully. He had been humiliated, mocked, denied, displaced, but he had endured without surrendering his dignity. And when the truth of his identity had emerged, it had not only restored his honor, but revealed the emptiness of those who sought to harm him. The applause behind him faded with distance, but its meaning remained. The story of the flight would spread, through videos, through conversations, through the voices of those who had seen, and it would stand as a reminder that injustice thrives in silence but falters when truth emerges. Elijah did not need to speak. His life, his resilience, his dignity had spoken louder than words. The message was clear. Cruelty can humiliate, arrogance can wound, prejudice can attempt to diminish, but dignity held steadfast will always rise again, shining brighter than the shadows cast upon it. The end. Thank you for staying with this story until the end. If it moved you, if it made you think about how dignity and justice matter in even the smallest moments, I'd love for you to support this channel. Hit that like button, subscribe so you don't miss the next story, and share it with someone who needs to hear it. I'm also curious about what you think. What part of Elijah's journey struck you the most, and how did you feel when the power shifted on that flight? Drop your thoughts in the comments, and let me know where in the world you're watching from. Your voice matters here, and I can't wait to read what you have to say.